Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre.
And I'm Vianora Vinca. Suicide missions, murders of law enforcement officers, and an increase in extremist militias. No, the scenario is not from the Middle East or South Asia. This is a description of what's happening right here in the U.S., according to a study just released by a leading civil rights organization.
On this edition of Independent Sources, we talk with the author of this recent report on hate groups and their growing numbers.
We look at another report, this one about a decline in the number of undocumented immigrants living in the U.S.
And we learn about the emotional toll on immigrants who live in this country legally but are not allowed to work.
We'll have those stories and news of the week after this.
A big part of this community reads the media that focuses more on where they came from and their communities, particularly in the city where so many people have come from overseas. The ethnic media is really important.
The number of hate groups in the U.S. is increasing at alarming rates, in some cases by more than 40%. That's according to a report recently released by the Southern Poverty Law Center, a civil rights organization that tracks their activities. With me via Skype from the headquarters of the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, is Mark Potok, the author of the report. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mark, in your report, you mentioned 1,000 hate groups in the last 10 years or so. And my first question to you, why are these groups mushrooming? And what are they about? Who are they?
Well, there are really several different things going on with different kind of sectors of the radical right. We've seen a long, steady growth in what we call hate groups, that is really race-based groups like the Klan, neo-Nazi groups, and so on. That long, steady ascent began around 2000 and has continued right up through the last year, to the point where we've got nearly 1,000 hate groups now. In addition to that, just in the last 12 or so months, we've seen a huge growth in the number of anti-immigration groups, the real hardline, essentially vigilante groups that are often known as Minuteman groups. These are people that go down to the border with guns and confront would-be crossers and so on. And those kinds of groups have grown by some 80% in a single year. Then finally, and most explosively, we have seen just an enormous growth in the so-called Patriot movement. The Patriot movement was what most people thought of back in the 1990s as the militia movement. The militias are really, in effect, the kind of paramilitary wing of the Patriot movement. The Patriot movement literally exploded last year. We saw 245% growth in a single year, 363 new groups. What I should explain to people is what Patriot groups really are and what makes them different from other types of groups on the radical right. The Patriot groups are groups that basically believe that the federal government is the primary enemy out there. The federal government is involved in evil, secret conspiracies which involve imposing martial law on the United States, herding good Americans into concentration camps, and ultimately forcing our country into a kind of socialistic, quote-unquote, New World Order.
Mark, do these groups back up their rhetoric with violence?
Well, it is rather rare that you see the groups as groups carrying out acts of violence today. That certainly was the case in the bad old days of former Klans and so on. But today, law enforcement coverage is so heavy and serious that you very rarely see that kind of action. Instead, what we see are so-called lone wolves, people who may be involved in the groups or at least in the milieu of the groups. Oftentimes, they're simply kind of hangers-on in the scene who have absorbed the rhetoric and the ideology and the conspiracy theories, but not actually joined. So examples of that are Timothy McVeigh, a man who basically acted alone in blowing up the Oklahoma City Federal Building. In fact, they had two Confederates. And Eric Rudolph, the Olympic bomber, a guy who blew up an abortion clinic down here in Alabama and murdered a police officer as well. These are people who essentially acted on their own.
Well, you also single out the Patriot and the militia groups as being of real concern. Why is that?
Well, for one thing, because they're growing so extremely rapidly. But strangely enough, perhaps, back in the 1990s, when the militia movement, this Patriot movement, was so large, the vast majority of criminal violence from the radical right came, in fact, from members of the Patriot movement, as opposed to, say, Klansmen or neo-Nazis, or even the hardline anti-immigrant activists. And, so that's just, we've seen, and I think it has to do with the fact that these people are driven by conspiracy theories that paint very evil enemies, albeit on the basis of completely groundless ideas. So, you know, many of these people really believe that the federal government is all about doing in sort of liberty-loving Americans. They are a really, you know, wicked enemy.
Well, also, you mentioned in your report that in the last year alone, more than 200 of these groups have been formed. How much does the presidency of Barack Obama have to do with these people founding these groups?
I think it has a lot to do with the growth of these groups. And it is connected to a larger idea, which is the changing demographics of this country. The Census Bureau has predicted that whites in America will lose their majority. They will fall below the 50% line long about the year 2050. This has really set off a very large amount of anger and fear and frustration in some quarters, particularly on the radical right, but also in some ostensibly more mainstream sections of the white population out there. It's been important that we've seen a lot of terrorism directed at Obama or attempted terrorism since he was nominated, by far more than what we've seen over the previous 10 years or so.
Speaking of mainstream, how much is the mainstream media playing a role in stoking these groups along? Do you think that's having a negative effect or an effect on helping these groups find a grounding?
I absolutely do. I think not only certain ostensibly mainstream media commentators, but also a number of leading politicians have absolutely, in my view, aided and abetted the growth of this movement and its groundless conspiracy theories.
Anybody in particular stands out?
Sure. I mean, you know, on the media side, we have people like Glenn Beck who talk about FEMA running a secret set of concentration camps. We have Lou Dobbs, who, before he was finally thrown off CNN, would routinely say falsehoods on his show and talk about things like a secret Mexican conspiracy to reconquer the American Southwest. And then we have a large number of politicians, Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann from Minnesota, who talks about Obama secretly setting up political re-education camps to turn all our little children into Marxist robots. We have Spencer Baucus, a congressman from Alabama, talking about he knows that there are 17 secret socialists in the U.S. Congress. He's not going to name them, of course, but by golly, they're there. You know, and it goes on and on. Tom Tancredo, the former congressman from Colorado, who also talked about this secret conspiracy on the part of Mexico to, you know, destroy America and so on. So, you know, that is a difference between this period and the first period of the militias back in the 90s, when certainly they had some talk radio hosts and so on, essentially parroting their propaganda. But we have people in positions of much more authority out there. You know, Glenn Beck has 3 million listeners every day. So, you know, if even a tiny percentage of those people actually believe some of the things he's saying, that's a danger.
Mark, I wanted you to elaborate a little bit on something you mentioned in the report that talks about the Tea Parties, and you say they're not extremist groups, but, and I quote, they are shot through with rich veins of radical ideas, conspiracy theories, and racism. How do you explain that?
Well, I think it's very clear. I mean, you know, for instance, we had a guy just the other day, a spokesman for the Tea Party Express, who has made a whole series of comments that I won't repeat about Black Americans. You can imagine the tenor of them. We have seen at the Tea Parties any number of these, you know, Obama being compared to a witch doctor kind of things, you know. So there's a fair amount of racialism in the movement. Clearly, the ideas about FEMA concentration camps, about the Federal Reserve not really being a central bank but being a private corporation designed to benefit certain international bankers, and on and on. These are ideas that come right out of the Patriot movement. and have been absorbed by many in the Tea Parties. What I was trying to say in that line was, look, you cannot fairly call the Tea Parties simply flat out as extremist groups per se. I think that would not be fair. I think, in fact, there are a lot of kind of little old grandmothers who have been frightened to death about what's going to happen if, say, a public option on healthcare passes. I've got to say that the way they've been frightened is in the same way that we were talking about Michelle Bachmann and so on. When a Sarah Palin, vice presidential candidate of a major party, says that Obama is setting up death panels in order to decide whether your grandma will live or die, to save $5 for the federal government, it's not surprising that we see these people so upset. So I don't think they're well described as uniformly extremist. But I don't think there's any question at all that those ideas are very much present in that world.
Mark, one last question. We see now there's a movement afoot for people to carry concealed weapons, in places like Starbucks. Is there a correlation between that movement and the hate group?
Well, I think the correlation is that although it never happened and there was no serious sign that it would, the fact that Barack Obama was seen as a relatively liberal Democrat was seen by people on the right as absolutely a certain omen that gun control was coming, that the government was going to come for your guns and your ammunition and so on. And as a result, in the aftermath of Obama's election, we saw absolutely enormous buying sprees, particularly of ammunition, but of weapons as well. So, is that the same thing? No, it's, I wouldn't say it's directly related to hate groups or even extremist groups, but it comes from the same kind of mindset that the Democrats are somehow playing ball with an evil global cabal. And part of the first step, presumably before they impose martial law, will be to seize our weapons so we can't resist the forces of the New World Order.
Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it at that. But this is an issue we'll continue to follow. Mark Potok of the Southern Poverty Law Center, thanks for being with us.
And thank you for having me. I do appreciate it.
Now here's Abi Ishola with some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. From the final call, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, is looking to employ thousands of Haitians to help rebuild the earthquake-torn island. Representatives from the UNDP say the work would help get families back on their feet and reduce social tension. But a spokesperson from the nonprofit organization, the December 12th Movement, says Haitians are being taken advantage of since they will only be paid less than $5 a day. A shortage of pediatric doctors in the United States is causing special needs children to wait longer to receive health care. New America Media reports that many medical students are choosing adult practices over pediatrics. The report says students avoid pediatrics because medical reimbursement rates are lower, student loans for the practice are higher, and pediatrics requires more schooling. The Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council finds that starting a small business in New York may not be the best move. The Virginia-based organization issued a study that says New York, California, and New Jersey are the worst states to start a business, while areas in the Midwest rank the highest. The study ranks states according to a number of issues, including state and federal legislation, access to capital, taxes, and energy costs. That from the Amsterdam News. And finally, from the Forward, how far would you go for a good bagel? Owners of the Mile End Deli in Brooklyn drive to Montreal, Canada every Friday night to pick up the beloved bagels they sell every Saturday morning. The two came up with the idea once they noticed shipping costs were eating into their profits. Those are just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Back to you, Vianora.
The Department of Homeland Security reports that between 2008 and 2009, the number of illegal immigrants living in the U.S. declined by almost 1 million. The number dropped from 11.6 million to 10.8 million. This is the sharpest decrease in 30 years. In which communities are the numbers dropping? Why? And what impact will this have on immigration reform? With me is Suzanne Ma. She reports on Chinatown for DNAinfo, a local news service. Also here is Madhulika Khandelwal, Director of the Asian American Center at Queens College. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Suzanne, let me start with you. What's happening within the Chinese community with these figures we're seeing of a supposed sharp decrease in the number of illegal immigrants?
Right. So what American immigration officials and law enforcement will say is that there is a harsher sentencing of smugglers called snakeheads in the Chinese culture. And the most high-profile incident would be Sister Ping, who is a very notorious snakehead who was arrested and sentenced in 2005 for more than 30 years in prison. And you also see detained and deported undocumented immigrants. And you'll also see increased border controls and coast guards. And that in itself would contribute to this drop that we see in undocumented immigrants. But you also need to look at what's at play in terms of the American economy in a recession and the Chinese economy on the rise.
So there are a lot of factors, and the debate is still going on the cause of this decline. And for the Chinese community, they say that the number was cut in half. What do you make of that number?
What's happening is you have undocumented immigrants deciding whether or not they should come to America, whether or not they should risk life and limb. In the 90s, we saw so many newspaper headlines showing boatloads of undocumented immigrants crashing into the coast of California or to Queens, people really risking everything to make it to America. Now there's opportunity in China, so is it worth it for them to come here and strike it out here when there could be a chance to open a hotel or a factory in China?
Madhulika, we see an increase of the number of illegal immigrants within the Indian community in this whole picture of supposed decline in the number of undocumented immigrants. Why are we seeing an increase for the Indian population?
I think I want to second what Suzanne had also said, that these numbers have to be seen in a larger context of what has been happening with immigration, what has been happening in these communities in New York City and all over the country. And also it gives us the opportunity to look at immigration and undocumented immigration, but immigration as a whole, but what has been happening. And generally, there has been this perception, when I talk to people, that undocumented immigrants are here because they cross the border. And we have tighter controls over the borders, and we'll have a decline in the undocumented immigration. It may be true in some communities and to some extent, but there are also a large number of undocumented immigrants who have been here because they have overstayed the visas. Because immigration is a more complex story than just crossing the border, even though that itself is quite a big issue. So we find a lot of, and I'm going to say human beings, immigrants are also human beings, who come to this country, and they may decide then if they're going to stay here. And a lot of them stay on here. So while I don't have exact reasons for why the Indian numbers are not declining, and they're growing, but I can have some insights into what I see in the communities.
And are the numbers increasing because people are overstaying their visas or they're just laid off?
Well, I would say yes, it's true that we have a lot of IT people, and sometimes we hear the stories more on the IT sector, but there are also other immigrants as well, if you talk of the Indian population here also. And there are people who are sponsored by their families, or they come as visitors. There are a lot of more working class and lower income or lower middle class, at least, immigrants who are also coming here.
Let's talk about how these numbers, this report, will affect immigration reform. Suzanne, how do you think that this will pan out for the Chinese community?
It's a little worrisome, I think. On the ground, if you spend time in Manhattan, Chinatown, you will hear or you will see that undocumented immigrants continue to arrive weekly from Fujian province, mostly from the southeast coast of China. And these immigrants need a lot of help. They need access to social services. They need to get a lawyer, and they need to figure out what their next steps are. And when you see a drop like this, such a dramatic drop, it's really dangerous because maybe the government won't be paying attention so much to the undocumented Chinese immigrants, thinking that they're not so much of a problem anymore, but they are indeed. And I think that you have to sort of look at this report and realize that how many undocumented immigrants are under the radar and aren't included in this report. And I would argue that they still continue to arrive. It just might be the different kinds of people, the people who couldn't make it in China, who have decided to come over here. If they've explored options in China, then they've decided that it's not working out, then they would try to make it over here as undocumented immigrants.
Madhulika, what do you think? How will this affect immigration?
And I want to
reform?
continue what Suzanne was saying. And for the Indian communities and many other communities that I know about, I think these numbers should not take away from the fact that the immigration reform is really imperative. We really need to fix the system. And there are, millions of people, really not even thousands, millions of people here who are calling out for, so by focusing on the undocumented numbers declining, we should not lose sight of the people who are already here, right? And really we have to think about what kind of services, what kind of advocacy, leadership we need to have in these communities. So one thing I want to say is, while we focus on the undocumented numbers and how they're changing, we should also not create this very big divide between the documented and the undocumented immigrants. It's almost like, to me, it's almost not human to call somebody, in fact, illegal. This idea that somebody is an illegal person as such, right? So I think immigration as such has to be addressed, and immigration reform needs to be taken care of.
Suzanne, I'd like to add to that. Just in my experiences reporting on undocumented immigrants living in New York City, a lot of these people have been here for more than a decade, maybe two, and they have American-born children. They moved here as young people, met somebody and ended up raising a family here. And so these are people who are essentially rooted in American society, who have managed to find a job, make a living, and raise their children here, and they are in need of a lot of attention, and we can't let this report take any attention away from them.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but there's so much more on this issue to talk about. Suzanne Ma and Madhulika Khandelwal, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks. We'll be right back.
You promised me the world. Is this what you had in mind?
Help EarthShare and its members restore balance to the world. Visit earthshare.org and see what you can do. EarthShare, one environment, one simple way to care for it.
We end our show with a look at the emotional toll of being unemployed. In previous shows, we've reported on H-1B visa holders, skilled professionals authorized to work in this country. This week, we want to highlight the other half, sometimes called their better half. What happens to the spouses of H-1B visa holders who are not allowed to work, especially when they are professionals too? Anjanette Levert brings us the story of an immigrant from India who made a film that documents her experience.
I'm Meghna Damani, and I made a film called Heart Suspended.
I didn't think twice about giving it all up and moving to America after marrying my boyfriend of 8 years.
It's a film about women who come to the United States on a dependent spouse visa, and although they're in the country legally, they're not allowed to work. So when I came here, it was a big shock because I thought I would be able to get work a lot more easier because I had a master's degree and I was working in a multinational company.
5 years later, I'm still not allowed to work or have any form of income.
And at the same time, adjusting to the whole new country, everything was different. And for everything, I had to be dependent on my husband. And I wasn't used to that because in India I was working, and although I was living with my family, but it was still kind of like, I never had to ask or think. One day I was, just sitting at my desk, and it was really too much for me to take. And I felt like I just wanted to kill myself. That was a big wake-up call. And so when my husband came home, I told him what happened, and he said, you know, whatever it takes, you have to get out of this situation. And then I encountered this practice of chanting Namyo Renge Kyo. So I had this very clear moment where when I was chanting, where I felt like, because I feel so strongly about this, I'm the person who has to speak up and do something about this. The whole process was so excruciatingly difficult because, you know, I didn't want to accept that I'm this suffering person. I was supposed to meet with So I started looking for women, you know, to interview. And nobody wanted to talk about it.
There are obviously, you know, certain financial considerations associated with that.
I wanted to show this tension that happens in the relationship.
What ownership and accountability should I be taking?
Do you even know what we have in our bank account?
It's not my money.
Oh, let's have another conversation some other time.
Abi, I'd like to finish this conversation.
After I put that scene into the film and he saw it for the first time, he was very hurt. He felt like he had always been supportive and that he came across as being totally not. And for me too, that was a big awakening because I didn't realize that I had all this resentment towards him. Because I felt like, you know, because every time I spoke of him, I would say, oh, he's really supportive, and I did feel he was supportive. But I guess underneath, you know, for the period of all this time, like, so every time I got rejected, every time something didn't work out, I was probably blaming him because I'm here in this country because of him. It's not that somebody forced you to come here. It's a choice, you know, you made. But I think it's a choice that people make in the hope of things, like, you know, in the hope of something that's going to change.
We take a look at the lives of immigrant women on H-4 visas.
The impact of the film now is that, you know, a lot of people within the community have started talking about this issue, which was not considered an issue before. Because within the community there are many other issues, and this is considered an issue that is to, you know, dealing with the middle class women who are supposedly, you know, not in such dire circumstances. I think everybody should see this film because it's a human issue of how we view work in society. You know, how much work impacts our self-esteem and who we are, and what kind of society are we building where the first question we ask somebody is, what do you do? And, you know, how much do you earn? You don't ask that, but you kind of try to gauge that. And, you know, that we are evaluated by all these things, whereas we don't look at the person, you know, for who they are. And I think that's been one of the biggest gifts to me, where having been unemployed for 5 years and not being able to get employment, I started viewing myself as a human being and others too.
Life, in its infinite vastness, does not define us on the basis of our jobs, education, or salary. Nor does it categorize us as dependent or independent. Time and again, it reminds us that we are all interdependent.
That's our show. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week.
In the meantime, be independent-minded.